Of course, adapting is the greatest thing after you anticipate and recognize and so on. As our world is uncertain, complex, ambiguous, and dynamic worlds that we used before, human environment systems must have the ability to adapt to continuously develop along their preferred expected scenarios while remaining within human and environmental boundaries. Otherwise, the systems eventually end up on completely different developmental paths, which are undesirable at best and cataclysmic at worst. The function of adapting can be disaggregated in many different ways. One way of doing so concretizes this overall function by defining 5 constituent functions on a lower level of abstraction. So we'll read a box soon about this. First of all, human environment systems adapt to anticipated potential deviations from the preferred expected development trajectory by reducing the likelihoods of the deviations in the first place. This is referred to as preventing and is the preferred adaptation function if possible in relation to the characteristics of the anticipated event and feasible in relation to social, technical, administrative, political, legal, economic and environmental constraints. So this is where the complexity of the human environment systems come in. All the spheres of human society construct we have to worry about. Prevention is thus an inherently proactive function, and it requires input from anticipation, monitoring and learning. As suggested in Chapter 4, prevention is possible for all but a few types of events, and the associated costs are often relatively low in relation to potential costs or even the expected costs if waiting until the event happens before reactively adapting the system. I've said this in disaster management, in adaptation as well, that building resilience is often much cheaper than managing event after event. But of course, upfront cost for building resilience is not small, so novel ways of accomplishing that, planning ahead, are needed. However, various potential events may require different prevention activities, often overwhelming not only different constraints but also the capacity for anticipation. So we talked about learning, but also having the data to learn, to anticipate. So if you don't know how to anticipate. Secondly, human environment systems adapt to anticipated potential deviations from the preferred expected development trajectory by reducing the consequences of such deviations beforehand. This is referred to as mitigating and is the next proactive adaptation choice after prevention. In contrast to preventing, there is not a single event that cannot be mitigated as long as it can be anticipated and the activities are socially, technically, administratively, politically, legally, economically and environmentally feasible. So even earthquakes and volcanoes can be mitigated if we anticipate them and prepare for them. Again, the associated costs are relatively low in relation to the potential or expected costs. Okay. 5 constituent functions for adapting human environment systems: preventing, so reducing the likelihood of anticipated potential deviations from the preferred expected scenario; mitigating, reducing on, keeps using the, is a non-native speaker, reducing beforehand the consequences of anticipated potential deviations from the preferred expected scenario; preparing beforehand to respond to and recover from anticipated potential deviations from the preferred expected scenario; responding is addressing the immediate consequences of actual deviations from the preferred expected scenario. So it's disaster management and recovery. Recovering is restoring the consequences of actual deviations back to the preferred expected scenario. So it's not about going back to the previous state, status quo, static conservation. It is about having a trajectory to sustainable development, and always coming back to head on the path again and not going back to previous functionality all the time. Okay, so I have jumped a couple of things here. So we talked about human environment adapt to anticipated potential potential deviations. Secondly, adapt to anticipated potential deviations from the I'm not doing this correctly. So preventing, mitigating, preparing. So thirdly, human environment systems adapt to anticipated potential deviations from the preferred expected development trajectory by preparing beforehand to respond to and recover from them when actually occurring. So this is disaster management and staying ahead in terms of protecting people, moving them out of danger, feeding them, and rehabilitating them, and so on. This is referred to as preparing and is the last I'm tired somehow. This is referred to as preparing and is the last resort in terms of proactive adaptation choices after preventing and mitigating. So you can also think of it as residual risk. After you've done all your prevention and mitigation, you will still have residual risk. Cyclones are not going away, sea level rise and inundation, storm surge, heat waves, nothing is really going away even if we stop global warming and emissions, net zero, everything. So you still have to be prepared for proactive adaptation as events happen. All possible events can be prepared for, both in the long term as informed by anticipation or learning, and in the short term as informed by either anticipation or monitoring. So early warning systems are part of that in the climate science sector, but here we are talking about this book's wording of what anticipation means. However, activities reducing the likelihoods or consequences of potential events on beforehand may target only parts of risk scenario space due to limits to anticipation and the constraints listed above. So here the author keeps on saying do something on beforehand, whereas in English we just say potential. So we say reducing the likelihood or consequences of potential events beforehand, whereas the author says reducing the likelihood or consequences of potential events on beforehand. So it's kind of a mistake that's carried throughout the book. I have to keep on reminding myself to drop the on as I read it. Okay, so not only by preparing for specific high-risk events, but also for addressing the needs that may arise in destructive events more generally. For instance, it's possible to conceive that people need clean drinking water regardless if they have been affected by, regardless of whether they have been affected by cyclone, drought, contamination, or terrorist attack, and to prepare the human environment system to be able to provide that regardless of what happens. However, such activities are also liable to the same categories of constraints as for preventing and mitigating: technical, social, etc., etc. Okay, so in addition to these three proactive constituent functions for adaptation, there are two inherently reactive functions. The fourth constituent function for adapting human environment systems then is referred to as responding, connoting that human environment systems adapt to actual deviations from the preferred expected development trajectory to address their immediate consequences. Responding requires, in other words, a situation that is markedly deviating from the preferred and expected state of human environment system at that particular time. So when a cyclone comes or a heat wave comes, action starts. Typically disaster management agencies go into full mode operational activities, and they don't actually worry about deviations from the trajectory, long-term pathway to sustainable development. They must respond immediately to saving lives, saving property, saving livelihoods and infrastructure, and so on and so forth. For instance, a situation with 18 cases of meningitis spotted last week in a town of 45,000 inhabitants, a situation in which a series of bombs have detonated in the public transport system of London, or a situation in which a tropical reef has lost 50% of its coral. All these are situations where action happens to get over the immediate impacts and set yourself on a recovery trajectory, and then come back to worrying about how far away you are from the path to sustainable development or resilience. Although responding is as vital as any other constituent function for adaptation, saving lives, alleviating suffering, and maintaining critical societal functions in actual disrupting events, it is by definition too late to save the lives that have already been lost and to protect the buildings that have already collapsed. So here we are in the vast majority of lives that were already lost when response to the 2010 Haiti earthquake started. It's not as simple, because when you have such collapsed buildings, there are often people trapped inside. Dogs are used to sniff out to see if people are inside, and sometimes you're not sure, so you don't want to bring in a bulldozer and try to clear out the debris. There is a reasonable amount of period over which rescue efforts continue, and after a certain amount of time, governments and disaster management agencies have to make the tough decision of saying the rescue part of the operation is over, and bulldozers will indeed start coming in to clear out the debris so that recovery part can proceed in terms of rebuilding. So those are tough decisions that have to be made. So this is long enough now. We'll go back and do learning in the next podcast. Okay, these are very useful things and put in a very different way than the usual disaster management kind of discussions we have, because this idea of preferred scenario and sustainable development are always driving the discussion here. Okay, see you in the next podcast.